As you're aware, tonight's topic is understanding and managing impacts of farmed prairie potholes. And if you're not familiar, Iowa is in a prairie pothole region where it's not uncommon to find perennially wet spots across the landscape that are remnants from when this area was covered by glaciers. So these wet spots become pretty problematic, and they've been the focus for some researchers in Iowa State. And tonight we've got two members of that Iowa State team Pothole to talk to us about these perennially wet spots and how to manage them. So we've got Amy Kaleita and Stephen Hall, and each of them brings a unique background to the table that I'll let them talk about here in a minute. But before I turn it over to Amy and Stephen, I'm first going to talk a little bit about Practical Farmers of Iowa and our Farminar Series. So this is our fall 2018 Farminar Series. We've done, I think, 153 Farminars to date. And so this is the start of our fall Farminar Series, where we've got 6 more planned to do between now and Christmas. So these are the remaining 5 topics after tonight. Hopefully there's another topic there that piques your interest and that you can tune in. So mark your calendars for those dates. We've got researchers and farmers and experts from within the PFI membership and from across the United States who are going to be leading these presentations. So a pretty diverse group, and I hope there's a few of these topics that you'll also want to tune back in for. Again, we do record these though, so there's a link on the bottom of this slide right here where you can find all the recordings for these Farminars, including this one tonight. So if you want to revisit this or share it with a friend, you can find it there within a couple days. So Practical Farmers of Iowa is a nonprofit member-based organization. And we began during the farm crisis more than 30 years ago. And our original focus at PFI was to help farmers reduce inputs and to farm in a way that benefits both the land and the people. And our focus today remains very much the same. So we have grown to, since then though, to include programming for farmers that raise livestock and fruits and vegetables as well, in addition to the row crops. That was one of our early focuses. And so we achieve, as you can see, our mission here, equipping farmers to build resilient farms and communities. We achieve that mission through farmer-to-farmer education. So a lot of our programming is farmer-led, and it's at least driven by our farmer members who request these topics and issues for us to focus on. So, and a few of the ways that we do that here is we hold on-farm field days, which we just wrapped up last week with our final on-farm field day of the year. And we do workshops and we do socials and we do them all the way across the state. And we're starting to do a few more things every year outside of Iowa as well. So really cover a lot of the Midwest, and a lot of the stuff we do isn't really, it's also applicable to farmers that are outside of Iowa. We also conduct on-farm research through our cooperators program on issues that our farmers are curious about. And so this time of year, we're about to hold our cooperators meeting where our farmers who are interested in conducting replicated on-farm research trials get together, talk about the issues they're having and the research projects that they want to be a part of. And we help design those, and then the farmers go out and collect data over the next year or 2 or 3 or more, depending on the research project. So we do on-farm research, and field days and workshops and socials. And of course, this Farminar is another example of the way that we do our programming. There are 2 events in particular that are coming up soon that I wanted to mention. Firstly is the Beginning Farmer Retreat, which is November 30th and December 1st in Montour, Iowa, Tama County. And that's for beginning and aspiring farmers. It's a great opportunity to get together and network and learn from each other and help build the foundation for a sustainable farm business. And then the other event is our annual conference, which we just released all the information about. That is going to happen January 18th and 19th here in Ames on the ISU campus. And we have our program on our website right now and out being delivered to your mailbox if you're on our mailing list. If you're not, you can get on our website and request one. But we've got more than 50 sessions planned. We've got a keynote speaker this year. There's Michael Phillips, who is the holistic orchardist, and he's going to talk about mycorrhizal fungi and soil health, and a lot of interesting, make a lot of interesting connections between soil health and plant health, and that'll be really great. We're glad to have Michael Phillips coming from, I believe, well, up in the Northeast is where Michael's coming from, Vermont, I believe. So anyways, get information about all those 50 sessions that are on our website and Michael Phillips, and get online and you can register there as well. So plan to join us in Ames on January 18th and 19th. Also, I want to mention that PFI is a member-based organization, so we're member-led, and we'd love to have you join us. There's a number of reasons to join us, like discounts to our conference or the retreat or any of our other events that are not free already. So you get those discounts. You get our quarterly magazine that just went through a redesign. This beautiful quarterly magazine comes out, and it features all kinds of innovative work that our members and farmers are doing. You get access to our email discussion groups, where they're a great resource for people to pose questions and help each other out online. And you get to participate in our programming, which includes our cooperators program. Like I mentioned, that's our on-farm research program. You can be in our savings incentive program or labor for learning program. Both of those are for beginning and aspiring farmers. And a number of other ways that you can participate in programming as a member. But really, one of the main benefits of joining PFI is that you're joining a network of like-minded people who care about agriculture in Iowa and want to learn from each other. So again, there's information on our website about that at practicalfarmers.org. And lastly, a couple of quick points to make. Like I said, this is a new platform for us. We're using Zoom, obviously. And so if you want to ask questions to our speakers or to anybody else, you can use that Q&A button. There's an arrow right there that shows where your Q&A button should be, somewhere on your screen. It might be hidden until you hover over it. But go ahead and click that Q&A button. You can ask questions, you can answer questions, and I think you should be able to vote questions up that you're also looking for an answer for. So feel free to use that Q&A feature. And then if Amy and Stephen don't see your question come in while you ask it, I'll make sure that we circle back to that at the end. So we've got until 8:30 to get through the presentation and questions, and it's really, if we don't get your question answered while we go, we'll make sure we circle back for it at the end. One thing is just to please be respectful of our speakers and of the other attendees. We like to welcome everyone. We're a diverse audience. Just keep that in mind. And then finally, we do look for some feedback after these presentations. Let us know what you want to learn about in the future, and let us know how we can improve on our programming in the future as well. Anybody who takes that survey after there will be entered for in a drawing for some free PFI merch, hat or a shirt or something. We've got some new merchandise out there too that's pretty cool. So I'll be shooting you an email with that link to follow up with the survey. So we really do appreciate that feedback. But that's what I've got here for PFI and for housekeeping. So if Amy and Stephen are ready, they should be able to pull up their presentation, and we can get to the main event here.
In our eagerness to get started, we answered a question that we actually didn't answer. We're trying to like shout through the electronic ether about our inability to get our mic moving, but we will have an answer to that question very briefly, and I'll touch on that in a few slides. So yeah, I'm Amy Kaleita. And I'm going to get started, and then Stephen will be popping in as some of his material comes in. So we're going to be talking about prairie potholes, and as Steve mentioned, Iowa, especially the north central part of Iowa, is the very bottom end of the prairie pothole region, which extends on up into Canada. And in this part of the country, the world, most of these potholes are shallowish, a little bit on the small side, maybe a few acres to less than 10 acres in size, and many of them are farmed. And so we're really interested in trying to understand what are the drivers of flooding and yield suppression? Where's that water coming from? How do they fill up? How frequently do they fill up? And then what are the impacts on crop, on downstream water quantity, water flow, and also water quality. And amongst the group of us, we had just a lot of questions that were related to what are the crop impacts? Are there other things that we could be growing in these potholes that would provide maybe some ecosystem benefits, but also some economic return in places where the crop yields are sometimes depressed because of the flooding? How can we better understand how frequently different potholes flood and for how long? Some of the genesis of some of our work on this project was related to the Waters of the U.S. rule, or WOTUS, from the EPA. That triggered a lot of maybe anxiety or uncertainty over which potholes should be regulated as wetlands and which ones should not. And so we wanted to get in there with a better understanding of their behavior to try to inform that. And then we also had questions about what's happening in the soil below the potholes, what's happening in the atmosphere above the potholes, and are there gas emissions that we should be worried about? What are the water quality parameters in that standing water? And then what happens if we've got surface drainage there, like a standpipe to a subsurface drainage system that then routes that standing water through the tile lines? So as a group, there are 6 of us working on various aspects of these questions. I'm working on some of the water balance stuff and some of the hydrology stuff, and my colleague in Ag and Biosystems Engineering, Michelle, is working on the water quality. Dr. Andy Van Lukey in agronomy is looking specifically at the crop development, and his colleague Emily Heaton is looking at the survivability of different energy crops in there. And of course, Stephen is looking at the biogeochemistry. And we also have Adam Jenke, who is a wildlife research specialist. And a note on the wildlife, because there was that question. It's not something that we have looked at specifically in the potholes that we have studied. However, we know from some of Adam's other work and some work that he's been looking at that when there's water in these potholes, birds will use it. It's maybe not their most preferred or ideal ecosystem, but they will use these sort of small, patchy little spots of flooded area if the conditions are right. And actually, that's non-trivial, because there was at one time some conventional wisdom that was like, no, they only like kind of large bodies of standing wetlandy water and not these little ephemeral patchy things in the middle of a farm field. They wouldn't like that, but they do. They'll use whatever they can find.
So yeah, in particular, we're really interested in understanding the influence of potholes on nutrient dynamics. And really our work so far has been focusing mostly on nitrogen. And we think, just from some sort of first principles, that the potholes could be really important in terms of understanding nitrogen use efficiency at the farm scale. So what do we mean here, right? And so we're defining nitrogen use efficiency as the fraction of N that you add as fertilizer or manure, which is actually assimilated by the crop, right? And so on average, nitrogen use efficiency is on the order of 50%, right? Can be better, can be worse. And the key point here is that, nitrogen use efficiency is great from the farmer's perspective, right? If you can save on inputs in terms of applying less nitrogen, but it's also really crucial from the perspective of environmental impacts of excess nitrogen, right? Because all else equal, right, as your nitrogen use efficiency goes down, there's more potential for losing nitrogen as nitrate, right, to downstream ecosystems, as well as emissions of nitrous oxide from microbial activity. And so just to sort of walk you through these little schematics here, can you see my mouse?
Maybe I don't know. Oops. Probably not when we got it in slideshow.
Okay, that's right. So essentially on the left-hand side here, you have kind of a schematic of a well-drained upland soil. And so the brown box is the soil profile. And essentially we have 2 main sources of nitrogen to this cord plant, right? We have the fertilizer that we added, and we have nitrogen that's being released during the process of nitrogen mineralization in soil, right, the microbial process. So essentially, corn's going to take up some fraction of that added nitrogen, and then some residual, right, will be vulnerable either to leaching as nitrate or potentially to emissions as various nitrogen gases. So if we have a pothole depression where our crop is drowned out, right, we've lost the sink of nitrogen in plant biomass. And so we have much more nitrogen that's potentially vulnerable to loss, both as nitrate, right, leaching out the bottom of the profile, as well as nitrous oxide and other gases. So really, this is sort of our conceptual framework. We want to understand, well, how important are these inefficiencies in nitrogen use in potholes, sort of at the landscape scale? Oops.
Well, I think we're back over here.
Oops.
Okay.
Okay, all right. And you know, this is not only are potholes potentially hotspots of inefficient nitrogen use, but also they're accumulating nutrients from their surrounding catchments, right? We can think of each pothole as being surrounded by kind of a micro watershed of anywhere from a few acres to, you know, dozens or more acres in size, right? And so we can think of water moving across the soil surface or also through shallow subsurface flow paths and eventually converging on this pothole, potentially bringing us nitrogen, right? And so that nitrogen then is vulnerable to infiltration through the soil profile and potentially ultimately to export by tile lines. Right, so if we come back to this kind of cartoon of nitrogen cycling that I showed you before, you know, not only potentially are these pothole soils inefficient in terms of losing the nitrogen they already have, but they're also getting a subsidy of nutrients from upslope, both in terms of nitrate that's being funneled in to the depression, as well as nitrogen and soil particles, right, that are eroding into the pothole feature. And really, you know, when we think about this together, there's actually considerable potential for these potholes to be hotspots of these detrimental nitrogen losses. So not only costing farmers money, but actually, you know, potentially representing a dominant source of environmental impacts at the watershed scale.
So our first pass at trying to get a handle on some of these issues, where is the water coming from and how much of it is there and what is it bringing in with it and what are the nutrient dynamics, the unique nutrient dynamics that exist in those little potholes. So we've got a field site just south of campus here in Ames where we've been monitoring a set of potholes in what this land is owned by Iowa State, but it's managed pretty conventionally for the most part. This graphic shows maybe some funny plot stuff in one section of the field that's not there anymore. It's really just a corn and soybean rotation. And it's got a sort of typical arrangement of like some of the potholes have kind of intense pattern tiling underneath and some have tile that kind of scoots around nearby. Some have surface inlets and some don't. And so we've got a whole arrangement of conditions as well as a set of like different kind of watershed to pothole sizes. And you might be looking at this, and then there's another one that we've got that's shown kind of in the bottom right of this graphic that's a couple miles away from this site that is a pothole that has been put into CRP, and it's been in CRP for more than a decade. So that provides us with an opportunity to look at how the dynamics are different when the soil conditions and the land cover is very different. And you might look at this map and be like, well, shoot, this is kind of a lot of potholes in a small area. And some of the other research that's been happening in one of the other groups that's looking at kind of prairie pothole dynamics out of Iowa State has made a map of all of the prairie potholes in this region. And it's really, this is not atypical in terms of density of prairie potholes. There's quite a few of them. So we are monitoring water level on a 15-minute basis in each of these potholes. And actually in the last year, we added a couple more where we're gonna be planting some miscanthus to study whether that's a crop that could survive there. And every time there is standing water in any of these potholes, we go out and we collect water quality samples, water samples that we bring back to the lab and we test for water quality. So, and then we've got rainfall data and soil moisture data. And then Stephen's going to show you one of the sites where, one of those potholes where he is monitoring emissions and nitrogen leaching. Do you want to say anything about that right now? Or
yeah. And just to follow up on Amy's point about the abundance of potholes, right? In the scale of the Des Moines lobe, on the order of, I'm blanking on the exact number, it's somewhere on the order of 7 to 9% of the total landscape is comprised of these potholes, right? So they're really, pretty widespread across this region.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't have the 2018 data to show you, although the 2018 data was really quite fantastic. And because it just rained buckets and buckets and buckets, and then it kept raining for a long time. But I do have the 2016 and 2017 water level data. So 2017 was a year that was relatively dry, although we had one pothole that was flooded on a number of occasions, and on one occasion for a fairly long period of time. But the other ones, there was maybe a little pop of flooding early in the season, and then they didn't flood after that in 2017. But those early season flooding events, you get a couple of days of standing water when the crops are just babies, and they will not survive. And so in these potholes at this site, sometimes they will go in and replant, and sometimes they'll just give it up. And so we had sort of a variety of conditions about whether or not by the end of the season, even if there's just been flooding at the beginning, whether there will be any crop there at the end is a bit of a question mark. Now in 2016, we had a lot of rain, particularly in the latter half of the season, and we saw a great deal of flooding. So what I want to call your attention to in the table down below is maybe look at the row that's labeled inundation percent. So this is the percent of the days that we monitored from we put our equipment in right after planting, and we pulled our equipment out right before harvest. So we're really capturing just the growing season. That's the percent of the days in that growing season that the pothole was flooded. And so you see that over the 2 years that we were studying, we had, a couple of the potholes that were flooded for 1 or 2% of the time, and then a few of the potholes that were flooded for 13, 16, 28% of the days. So some pretty significant impacts to the crops in those potholes that flooded for that many days.
We want to emphasize too that most of these potholes are fairly intensely tile drained, right? And so that's sort of the remarkable thing, at least for me, is that even with surface inlets, right, you can have fairly sustained periods of flooding lasting for days or more.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So we found that drainage does make a difference, but it doesn't prevent there from being adverse flooding enough to drown out the crop or significantly suppress the yield. So we looked at, over the course of our monitoring season, what was the typical flooding event like? Because we know that a flooding event of 1 day or less, you might have some yield depression, but you are not likely necessarily to have total yield loss. Once you get to 2 days and more, that's where you start to see the possibility of complete failure of the crop. And so most of the ponding events were in the less than 2 day category. But what that also means is that over half were less than 2 days, but like a very significant percent were longer than 2 days. So, and then we did see that out of the 7 potholes times 2 growing seasons, 4 times, so in 4 of those cases, there was complete crop failure. And it was either due to wet conditions at the beginning that drowned the crops early, wet conditions at the end that prevented that area from being harvested. And so you can get hit on both ends of the season in terms of when those potholes are wet. And then 6 of the 8 potholes had at least one event of 5 or more days, and that's a nearly 100% crop killer. You're not going to see a whole lot of survival with a length that long.
What about this year? Do you have any sense of how adding this year would change the story?
Yeah, we hired a whole nother graduate student just to look at 2018 because it flooded so much. So we're going to have a great water quality story to tell because the flooding was so significant, and we did see a lot of loss in those, and it was all through the growing season. Some that had survived some early season flooding. then sort of failed to make in mid-season when there was longer events. And then by the time we got to the end of the season, the only thing living in there was weeds. So yeah, so I think with the 2018 events, we'll see even more flooding than these ones. So we looked at what the dynamics, the temporal dynamics, the time dynamics of when we were picking up nitrate in the standing water in the pothole. What we saw was a not surprising, we'd see high concentrations of nitrate that would kind of flush in early in the season. Lots of nitrate availability in the soil and not a whole lot of crop uptake and cool conditions, and you get that flooding event. And we did see some very high levels of nitrate in the pothole itself. And then later in the season, just in the standing water, we didn't see as high of concentrations. And in some cases, we didn't see any.
But the story is different in the soil, which we'll get into in just a second.
Right, it is much different in the soil than it is up above. But we were also looking at phosphorus, and the phosphorus dynamics were a bit of a surprise. I think we had assumed that we were going to see phosphorus come in, adhere to the sediment particles, and it was largely going to be total phosphorus that was dominated by the sediment delivery into the potholes. But actually, what we found was that there was a very surprisingly high amount of dissolved reactive phosphorus, and that the dissolved reactive phosphorus concentration increased over the course of an inundation event, even when the water level was not changing. So it wasn't just that the volume is decreasing and the phosphorus is staying there, and so that's why the concentration was increasing. Even when the water levels were the same or increasing, we were seeing this increase in dissolved reactive phosphorus. And you think about what that means for when there is a surface inlet in there, and the extent to which these potholes now represent a surprise source of dissolved reactive phosphorus into the tile lines, which is not something that has gotten a whole lot of attention. And then also, as that water moves out through the soil and into the tile line, that phosphorus in dissolved form potentially leaving in that pathway as well. So I'm going to continue to keep an eye on that. So we also took a look at what would happen if we thought about, could we manage these things differently? So these are some results from a modeling study where we took the data that we had and we developed a hydrology model that matched the observed data really well. And then we started tinkering with the settings in the model to say, well, what would happen if we retired the pothole completely and put it into CRP like the one that we are observing that is in that management? And what would happen if we changed from a fairly aggressive tillage strategy that's used at this field to a no-till strategy? And that's what you're seeing in the bar chart that's labeled conserved. So what we found is that retirement will increase the number of days that the pothole is flooded, because we assumed that that retirement also means if there was a surface inlet there, we would take it out. And so we've got two cases here, one that had multiple surface inlets, so the response there of taking those out is much stronger in that pothole than in the one that only had one. The response in the number of days flooded is a little bit higher. But if you're not trying to grow something there to get a profit off of it, then it doesn't matter so much if it's flooded. And then you get all the bird benefits and other wildlife and that sort of thing. What we found is that switching to a no-till practice increased the infiltration that would happen sort of like before these events, and so decreased the amount of surface and shallow subsurface delivery that came in the event by providing a little bit more soil water storage. So changing from aggressive tillage to a no-till situation reduced the number of inundated years, the number of days inundated per year by a couple of days, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but if 2 days is enough to kill your crop and you get from 2 days to 1 day, then you're in a good situation.
So yeah, back to the nitrogen story, right? So you recall that sort of cartoon of nitrogen use efficiency, right? Where we predict, well, if you kill the crop, right, you've got all of this excess nitrogen hanging around. So do we observe this? And so I'll back up to this figure here, right? And so these names here inside the red lines, these are all of our different potholes. So peak growing season of 2018, in August, we went out and we comprehensively sampled soils from all of these potholes. Essentially, we're taking transects from sort of the bottom of the pothole depression up, sort of upslope, walking into well-drained terrain. And so what did we find? Well, what we found was that in the potholes, the nitrate, so the extractable nitrate in the soil, was on the order of three times greater in the potholes than it was in the relatively well-drained upland soils. And this was consistent both in shallow and deeper soil horizons, consistent both across fields under corn and soybean. So we've got this nitrate. Well, can we move it? Do these nitrate stocks actually translate into loads that are getting exported in tiles? And so to sort of get at this question, we did some more intensive measurements just along one of these transects from the bottom of the pothole walking up slope. And what we did is install some lysimeters, we call these. Essentially, we dig soil pits, and we install these lysimeters into undisturbed soil by excavating a little trench, right? And so what these do is we're able then to sample the infiltrating soil water that's coming in from surface and shallow subsurface flow, and then after each rainfall or snowmelt event, we're able to sample the soil solution. So what did we find? We actually found greatest infiltration, so the greatest amount of water actually at the bottom of the pothole relative to upslope position. So this is kind of a funny graph here. So the x-axis is elevation along our transect, right? So here 0 is at the very bottom of the pothole, and 1.5 meters is towards sort of the top of that topographic sequence, right? And you can see some noise, but definitely a significant trend towards greater infiltration amount at the bottom of the pothole. And so really what this does is translates into greater nitrogen loads, also greater soluble phosphorus loads at the bottom of the pothole relative to upslope. And so this is data from 2017. We're in the process of working up the 2018 data, and we expect this pattern to be even more dramatic this year. And so one question we get a lot of is, well, these potholes, right, they're accumulating water, and these are, poorly drained soil. So how are we getting this movement of moisture through the profile? And we think there's some really interesting dynamics going on here. So I don't know if you've ever had a chance to walk around any of your pothole depressions during relatively dry periods. You might notice actually these kinds of fissures in the ground, and these are really common. These are due in part to the presence of shrink swell clays, so specific clay minerals that absorb and release moisture, and they actually expand and contract as a function of moisture, but also due to destruction of the soil structure as a consequence of ponding. And so what can happen, right, is you can pond, and basically before you totally saturate the soil, you can move a lot of water through this system. Eventually, you seal up the cracks and the infiltration slows down dramatically. But in that first period, right, when you're funneling water through, we're thinking this is probably explaining these pulses of nitrate that we see moving through the soil profile. So sort of the take-home point is, even if you don't have a surface inlet, you can get significant amounts of water moving through these pothole soil profiles.
I'd like to pop in with a mention of that, the 2017 year was one where there was some early season flooding. And then there was like a later season, very big event that only flooded one of the potholes. And for a while we were like, how come there was no water in any of those other ones? It was a really big event. And the modeling expert that we talked to, we were like, this model doesn't match up here at all. And how come, and we were looking at the precip records, and he was like, there's something wrong with your data. But what we finally decided was Stephen was like, well, there's really enormous cracks in the field, and we could practically see China from not, but yeah, they were very deep. And so you do get a lot of water. And if you think about the extent to which we would like water to maybe recharge the soil water reserve, when there's these giant cracks, there's a lot of loss that's actually not even recharging the soil water. It's just going right through the cracks and then into the tile drain system. So yeah.
Essentially it's a double whammy, right? You could think of early season events that maybe kill off the crop, and then, okay, it dries out, you get your cracks opening up, you get your nitrogen subsidy from upslope, and then the next big event, you're flushing that through the profile. Okay,
yeah,
so that's kind of the first
some great questions.
Oh yeah,
this one we're going to come to probably. So
yeah. Okay, so that's sort of the first stab at the nitrate story. I'd like to move on to one of our other sort of detrimental impacts of nitrogen. And this is sort of a question, I don't think there's an easy way to sort of pull you guys, but I'll just sort of, try to urge you to think about what is the single largest current climate change impact of our Corn Belt agricultural systems, right? And so this is kind of a question that I think it should be on our minds, right, as we think about sort of our relationship to the broader environmental systems. So throw out a few different options, right? Is it loss of soil organic matter, right? We know that we've lost lots of soil carbon. Is this sort of our largest contribution to climate change? Is it fuel use for field operations, right? We're driving a lot of equipment around. It's a major use of energy. Is it the fuel or the energy involved in making nitrogen fertilizer, right? This is an incredibly energy intensive process. Or is it actually nitrous oxide emissions from soil and water? And actually the kicker is D, actually by far the single largest impact of our sort of local ag systems on climate change are actually nitrous oxide emissions. And there's been a lot of work on trying to understand, well, how can we rebuild soil organic matter? Could we sequester carbon, right? Can we offset our climate impacts? Well, really, if we don't think about nitrous oxide, we're really missing kind of the biggest part of the story, because as long as we're using synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and manure, right, we're going to have significant nitrous oxide emissions that increasingly I think it behooves us to really think about how we might be able to mitigate some of these factors. Okay, so nitrous oxide is really kind of a bugaboo to study, because there are several different processes that microorganisms can do in soil that will generate nitrous oxide. And sort of the take-home message for understanding nitrous oxide emissions from our systems is there's sort of a sweet spot for nitrous oxide production that's a function of soil moisture. So I'll show you this figure here down in your lower right-hand part of your screen. On the x-axis, you have soil moisture. So this is the amount of pore space in the soil that's filled with water. And on the y-axis, we have nitrous oxide emissions. And this is data from a study we actually did in the lab, where we took hundreds of these soil cores and we're adding water at different levels, and we're using different soils, and we're torturing the soils in different ways. Essentially, the take-home point is that two of our major soil series both show this kind of sweet spot, kind of this, above well-drained conditions, but not totally saturated, right? So this is above field moisture capacity, but there's still some air in these soils. And essentially, we're coupling multiple nitrogen cycling processes together, right? If you've heard about this, we're coupling nitrification and denitrification, and we're leading to this sort of optimal N2O production. Well, you say, well, where on the landscape would we expect to see these sort of dynamics? Well, it turns out the potholes, in some sense, are kind of the perfect, sweet spots for making nitrous oxide, because we're constantly tipping around this kind of saturated threshold. Kind of these ideal situations for the microbes that make nitrous oxide. And so to go back right to those 5 potholes we saw on Amy's slide earlier, so this year we did some fairly high frequency measurements of nitrous oxide emissions from soil to the atmosphere. And this is kind of a complicated figure that I'll walk you through, but each kind of panel here, so each different name is a different pothole. So walnut, yam, bunny, miscanthus, lettuce. And then on the top panel here, you see soil moisture. These blue values are at the bottom of the pothole, and essentially for each pothole, as we move up slope, we get to these green values. So essentially blue is the bottom. And what you can see for nitrous oxide, in every single case, our largest nitrous oxide emissions are all happening at the bottom of the pothole, right? And they're sort of sporadic. They're coming, both before and after this kind of really peak flooding event that we saw in July. And this is really consistent with this idea of this kind of moisture sweet spot for nitrous oxide emissions. And so if we look at cumulative nitrous oxide emissions from these potholes at the landscape scale, these are really one of the dominant sources of nitrous oxide. And in a sense, this is maybe good news in a way that says, well, maybe we can have a large impact on mitigating N2O if we can do something different or something special, perhaps, in these potholes themselves. So sort of move into starting to think about the solutions, right? And this is where we'd love to get feedback from you all as to what you're doing. We've heard some great sort of anecdotal success stories from people of using conservation tillage to actually, just as Amy mentioned with the modeling results, right? This idea, well, can we build soil structure, build capacity to store water in the profile, perhaps decreasing the duration of flooding? There's been a lot of discussion about, well, could we target these potholes for adoption in CRP programs, right? Can we just say, well, enough is enough? Can we just retire these to perennial grassland, perhaps save money and achieve some environmental benefits? Or, alternatively, right, could we potentially think about other kinds of flood-tolerant crops that might survive these brief periods of inundation in the potholes? Specifically, well, can we think about, biomass, biomass energy sources, miscanthus, switchgrass, or other, mixtures of native species? Or finally, maybe perhaps more radical solution. Well, what if we really just massively improve drainage in some of these features and try to offset the impacts by constructing wetlands downstream, right? And so, whole sort of array of potential solutions. I don't think we're ready to necessarily advocate for any of them yet, but sort of potential things we might think about, so that we might.
So just to kind of drive home our thoughts on conservation tillage as a risk mitigation strategy, this is from some of the modeling results that shows for two of the potholes, the black colored lines are the current conditions that are fairly aggressive tillage, and then the green lines are the corresponding conservation tillage. And what's on the y-axis is the percent of the pothole area that gets flooded for 2 or more days. And that's kind of our threshold for what it takes to totally kill the crop. And then on the x-axis along the bottom is the percent of the years in our simulation. So what we see is that, under really high floody conditions that you would see maybe in 5% or fewer of the years, the influence of the management is very small. Those events are large enough that they will overwhelm the capacity of conservation tillage to address delivery of water into the pothole. And then in the sort of run-of-the-mill years, there's probably some percent of the pothole just going to flood every year. And so one of ours, Walnut, has has shown itself to be just some of it floods every year. And Bunny, on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily flood every year, but it floods a lot of years. But what we found is that in say the Walnut pothole, that we were able to reduce the area that was 50% likely to flood in any given year from 30% of the pothole to 20% of the pothole just by changing the tillage practices. So you think about the number of years that you spend in that 10 to 20 to 70% of the years, that's kind of a lot. So using conservation tillage as a risk mitigation strategy has a small but significant effect. And a lot of times, since we're looking at just edge effects maybe, and the difference of a couple of days, those changes can make a noticeable difference. Plus, then you get all of the other soil health benefits that come with a switch to conservation tillage. The other thing that we're doing is we're trying to come up with a less complicated way to model these features, and this was one of the efforts that we were engaged in, funded by the EPA. They were interested in us coming up with a method to maybe a simple way to classify these potholes in terms of their likelihood to flood. So we're working on building a simple tool where we're taking in rainfall data and something about the ratio of how big is the pothole compared to its drainage area. And then is it drained or undrained? Does it have surface inlets or not? And then kind of a toggle button for management, aggressive tillage, no-till, and maybe some other stuff. And then a little bit more weather data. And what we're finding is that we get a pretty good shot, a little bit more development left to do, but a pretty good shot at being able to come up with kind of a simple assessment tool where we might be able to provide some guidance in terms of what potholes are the most likely to be flooded and when. And then the next thing that we're starting up is looking at Stephen said, looking at whether or not some of those more grassy energy crops like switchgrass or miscanthus will do a better job of surviving those short bursts of inundation where the corn and soybeans do not prefer those conditions. And then Stephen's going to be looking at what are the nitrate and gas emissions impacts of those different management strategies. Yeah. And then, so I'll let Stephen do this while I troll the question and answer for things that we should address.
Yeah, so I guess sort of the take-home points, right? I mean, sort of the yield suppression in potholes is really obvious driving around the landscape, and we could invite, Andy to give us more of the sort of nuts and bolts economic details. But I guess, as you might know intuitively, a lot of these features lose money year after year, and sort of what we're adding on to that is that really that these are significant in terms of their environmental impacts as well, in terms of disproportionately high loads of nitrate and phosphorus from these features, as well as disproportionately high nitrous oxide emissions. And some of the potential solutions might go either of two ways, right? Can we embrace the fact that these are in some sense wetland features? Can we actually plant things in them that will survive, or can we actually change the water budget to make them infiltrate essentially by tillage or by altered drainage systems? So really, I think it's sort of exciting to think about what we might do.
Yeah.
So yeah, we just want to briefly thank our funders. So EPA, USDA, the Nutrient Research Center, and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture have sort of collectively contributed funds to several different aspects of this project. And there's sort of a much longer story that we could tell you, more nuanced, different pieces. But yeah, happy to dive into the questions.
Yeah. And then I just want to draw your attention to the other photo. This is the graduate student holding something in a cup. That's a freshwater shrimp that he pulled out of the pothole one of the days that he was out there monitoring. And you might think, how did they get in there? And the thing is that organism has eggs that desiccate and will stay shelf stable for like a decade if need be. And so those are the sorts of things where the eggs are just in the pothole soil, and then when the conditions are right, they'll hatch and complete their life cycle. But it was a surprise for the graduate student to look down and be like, what are all these things that are swimming in here? So that was a fun picture. So we've got a couple of questions that we're going to answer. So I'm going to take a stab at a question about how climate change is affecting the Prairie pothole region. So one of the things that we have noticed is that there are some interesting pothole dynamics that happen when you've got flood events that are followed by prolonged dry periods. And that is exactly the sort of thing that as the climate changes, we expect to see more of. So some of those dynamics that are significant now, we expect to see even more significance when we move into a situation where there's probably more propensity to flood and then more sustained periods of dry. So that's one of the things we're thinking about. The other thing is that when we have probably more periods that are of higher intensity events, those are the kinds of events that tend to fill up the pothole enough to let it stay waterlogged for several days. So what we are observing now in terms of the frequency of yield suppressing flooding, we would expect to see more of that as the rainfall patterns shift. You want to add anything? Or yeah, okay.
So yeah, greater proportion of the rainfall is thought to come in more of these more extreme events, and so that's been well documented.
So there's a question about couple of potholes that are maybe not the most productive areas in the crops that really in the field really only produce crops on dry years. And actually, it's an interesting question because one of the things that we do hear from some producers is that they like to keep those potholes kind of in the back pocket because in a dry year, those are maybe the only areas that really thrive. But our early returns on the economic data suggest that that is not enough to offset the expenses that you were dumping in there in the years where it does not really turn a profit. So, but let's see. Speaking specifically about controlling nitrate leaching in those potholes.
I think the best thing you can do, right, is to keep some plant growing in that system. And maybe, I mean, even if you say, well, we're going to continue to cultivate this area and we're going to continue to plant it, maybe the best thing you can do is simply not apply nitrogen to that pothole if you have capacity for variable rate, or even just to shut off your application system as you're driving over that pothole, right?
Because some influx anyway.
You're already getting a subsidy from upslope, and so anything you can do to decrease the nitrogen load in that area, right, I think is potentially going to help you. But then, barring that, anything you can do to keep some plant as a nitrogen sink in that system.
And that would be one of the impacts of maybe putting it in CRP or a pollinator or a prairie grass or things like that, is that then you do have more of the cover more of the year, right? And so a question about that: how far from the depression should the CRP extend? I think Stephen's nitrate and nitrogen data gives us some insights into that, and I have some insights into that too. It not far. We find that in those areas that where the pothole fills up, there is if it's an extreme event. We had one pothole spillover the whole time we were monitoring here. In the area that we're looking at, they don't spill over very often, and when they do, it's at a single point. So most of the benefit to converting the land use is really just in the pothole itself. So that would be kind of the highest priority. And then if you could extend it farther from the depression than that, but it's probably not going to give you that super high rate of, you're not going to see as much change in some of those dynamics once you get outside of the pothole area as you do inside. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question that we should look at. I know Andy from our team has some data showing that the yield suppression can extend beyond the pothole itself. So in that case, the more kind of the better. But right, it's and I think too, from a management perspective, well, what's sort of feasible? I mean, it might be that you need a certain patch size of CRP to make it worth your while in terms of driving around.
Right, or you're going to square it up. Or, So there's some, maybe that question, once you get into those wing areas, becomes more of a question of logistics and practicality than about the science. Okay. What about when the watersheds don't have outlets between, the downstream is full and the water has nowhere to go? This is a great question, Billy. So let me tell you about some of the potholes that we have at this site. We had a question about if there is all this drainage here, because we know there's tile lines underneath and we've got the surface inlets, why does it still stay flooded for so many days at a time? And there are a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of the water is coming in surface, but a lot of it is also coming in shallow subsurface, and so that takes hours to days to arrive. And so at some of our potholes, we did have this dynamic where we could hear the surface intake running. So we knew water was going down in there, but the water level was not changing because everything that went down into the surface drain, into the tile line, was replaced by water that could now move in from the micro watershed. So some of them are like that. Some of them, there is no room for more water to enter the drainage network. And in fact, didn't we have cases where there was water bubbling back up from the drainage network into the pothole? Yeah, I think your graduate student had captured some videos of water coming back up through, and in one case coming back up just through the soil. So that is not an easy thing to solve because you may not have any control over those drain lines downstream. And that's the case at one of our potholes. We're not even 100% sure where the drain line goes after that. We were just kind of drawing some sketchy lines on a map and all that stuff. And then somebody was like, well, I think this guy down here changed something and now we never get any drainage. And so it's a very complicated, that's a very complicated question. And so one of the things would be, even the potholes that we have that have a lot of drainage underneath and the drainage seems to be very functional, you're still really limited by that water has to move in through the soil in the first place. And also the surface inlet can only handle so much. So even lots of drainage is not gonna address all of the flooding.
Although upgrading mains, so if
Right.
you know, there's a concerted investment at the drainage
Right.
district scale to sort of let's make the end of the pipe bigger,
Right.
that can actually
Right.
have a big effect.
Right.
But that's, you know, that's not an easy thing
Yeah.
for an individual.
It's not gonna cause the pothole not to flood, but it would potentially decrease the number of those days of really long flooding, because I
Yes.
think in some of those really long ones, that's what we were waiting for, is capacity to move out the drain system. I think we would still see those short ones, the 1 and 2 and 3 day long events, even if we increased the drainage capacity. Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I can
Yeah,
handle
okay.
this. So there's a question: how well do the tall grasses grow without dying? So I think, right, so we know that many of our native species, right, are adapted to wet prairies. So a lot of our, you know, a lot of our native species are accustomed to having wet feet, right? They have actually anatomical adaptations to this. Essentially, they have cells that act like essentially drinking straws, where they're able to transport oxygen from the atmosphere down to their roots, and so those are called parenchyma. And so there's, you know, many of our species that are actually adapted to these short-term duration flooding events by their anatomy. So there's, you know, we know, right? We know, well, what stuff lives in wet prairies for a reason. So there are species out there that'll do this. It's just it's a question of, well, what do folks like you guys want to grow, and what's feasible and what's practical. I think that's maybe one of the interesting questions.
Yeah, good. So there's a question about some research that has come out of the Iowa Soybean Association, where they were looking at yield data from partner farmers and looked at some terrain data to identify where the potholes were, and then compared the historical yield data inside the pothole with the yield data outside of the potholes, and then looked at profitability and where, you know, are the potholes making money or they're not making money. And they identified that the potholes are consistently less profitable than the rest of the field. And we have seen that as well. So I think that Adam Kyle's work at the ISA has been very complimentary, and they're actually involved in early conversations about these same things. So we're all starting to ask the same questions. So yeah, I think that we felt like that was good justification to say, look, there's data out there to suggest that these are maybe not that profitable. And if they're not that profitable, would they then be much more affordable as conservation targets than taking our best land out of production? Mm-hmm. So yeah, so I have positive thoughts about that work that they've done there at the Soybean Association. And then there's a question about grass waterways, farm to farm. So it's really a question about how much of the problems in a pothole could we address with better surface drainage. And that's a question that I guess we haven't really thought about a whole lot, but it would require a significant amount, a not insignificant amount of earthwork to connect these potholes, even though the landscape shows that they have little points of connection. We would have to cut lines through them and physically connect them. And we haven't really run the math on what that might look like. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's a bunch of other questions here, sort of potpourri of different things related to prairie potholes. And I think it's really important to distinguish, these farmed depressions that we're talking about in this study versus sort of the classic either restored or, extant prairie pothole wetlands that are actually functioning as they were prior to European settlement, right? And so I think, our work is really focusing on these depressional features that are, in the middle of these intensive agricultural landscapes and trying to understand that functionality. We're not really addressing, this long-standing work that's looked at the environmental benefits of sort of these quote-unquote native prairie potholes.
Right, and if you look at prairie pothole stuff that comes out of the Dakotas and northern Minnesota and up into the Canadian provinces, the majority of them are sort of semi-native, right?
Yes.
And not these intensively farmed. They're also a little bit larger in size. Ours tend to be really shallow compared to the ones that you find moving north, and it's just a consequence of the glaciology and the sort of geomorphological history of the potholes, that ours ended up kind of flattish, and that they are now located in very productive farmland. So yeah, good. Okay, I think we answered that one.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, Amy and Stephen. It looks like, so in our Q&A chat box here, they've got through all those questions that are out there. So if you've got another one, we've got a little more time. So go ahead and get it in before we wrap this up. We've got Amy and Stephen on hand for a little more time, if need be. But thank you both for going through those and giving some great answers to some of those questions.
You are welcome. It was super fun. We I was telling Stephen earlier that this is sort of a scheduling thing. My husband's out of town, so my two young kids are down the hallway watching some shows on the big screen in one of our conference rooms. But they were like, "What are you talking about at this thing tonight?" And I was like, "Well, I'm talking about our pothole work." And they were like, "Oh, you love those." I do love those. And I, now to the point where like we'll be out for a nice drive as a family, and I'm looking out the window. I'm like, kids, look, it's a pothole. Look at that one. It doesn't have anything growing in it because everything drowned.
Or that one's in CRP.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
We actually have seen a lot of them, and some of them it looks like they're maybe not official CRP. They're just like somebody was like, "To heck with this thing," and I'm just not farming it anymore. It's just grass.
It seemed like in our area here, also, so I live in Boone County, and here come the office here in Ames and Story County, and in my area, it seemed like there was a lot of small areas that I'm not sure if they'd be considered a prairie pothole or not, but the shape makes me think that they are, that had actually gotten replanted in a lot of soybean fields, and they so they came back and harvested all the rest of their crops, and right now they're going back to harvest all the prairie potholes that were replanted several weeks later. Is that something that you've noticed in the area too?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, some of our potholes that we're studying are like that. They will get in there, and if it was corn and it died early, and then they'll come in and they'll just have a little patch of beans that's in there, and then sometimes that survives and sometimes it doesn't. So we've seen that at our own site, and then certainly just driving around, you see that a lot too. I think that it's, the management headaches that these things represent is also not insignificant. So there's like water quality impacts, there's nitrogen impacts, there's gas emissions impacts, but they're also just a pain in the butt to manage, because they are often, they're the places that you're waiting on to dry out before you can get into the field. And they are the last places to dry out at the end of the season when you're waiting for conditions to be right for harvest. Sometimes you just sacrifice that area because it's just not playing ball with you and the timing of your operations. And so people are doing all kinds of things, but it seems like a lot of the things that people are doing are because those places are a pretty significant nuisance. So we've got, some great questions. So aquaculture, and what could you make it a pond? So my sense is, at least from the ones in north central Iowa, again, it would be kind of an economic decision about the amount of earthwork that was required. And then often the watersheds are very tiny. So we get this flash of water delivery, but it would be difficult to sustain that level of water throughout the season, even if you didn't have drainage underneath. And we know that because we have some that don't really have as much drainage, and they are not wet all the year.
Yeah, pre-settlement conditions, right? Prior to, sort of our row crop systems and drainage, right? Many of these are really ephemeral systems where they're wetting up and drying down. And most commonly, they're wet right early in the year, but not at all uncommon for them to dry out by the end of summer.
Right. So, people have asked about, well, could we do wetland restoration? And we could, and we should think about that, but they're not going to look like a wetland like you might be thinking of if you're familiar with like the creek wetlands that are wet all the time. These are going to be features that are wet in a bursty sort of way. They're wet for several days at a time rather than for the whole season. Entrepreneurial opportunities for the prairie potholes. Oh, this is a great question. I consider some of our miscanthus activities to be entrepreneurial in nature at this point. This is really looking at kind of like potential future markets. But I think there might be, are there like recreational derived entrepreneurial activities that could be done there? I don't know. I guess I never really thought about that.
I don't know if they can find a rice cultivar that would be compatible with this sort of thing. I don't know.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question that I might come back to, Carl, and think about in my spare time, entrepreneurial activities for the potholes. Yeah, it's a good question. Very good.
Cool. Well, I think we are at a good point to wrap this up. So I want to definitely take a minute and thank Amy and Stephen again for taking their Tuesday night to share their research with us. This is certainly an interesting project that you guys are doing, and I guess could you just mention a little bit about the future of where this is going? What kind of timeline? How you've only been doing this for a couple of years. Could you mention if for those of us that want to keep an eye on what your research is?
Yeah.
How we do that and for how long?
Scroll on back to our awesome team. So one of the things that's fantastic about having a very active team and one of this size is that there are questions that we are generating all the time. And for people in the research business, when you generate a question, if you can write it up in a compelling way, then you can get some funding to study that. So I think since we first got the very initial funding for this, we've had a pretty steady stream of putting together compelling research questions that are kind of answering some very practical questions and then some very science-driven questions. So we're just getting started on the energy crop stuff. So that's a new thing that we'll be putting in some miscanthus in 19.
Next growing season we'll be growing miscanthus and potholes. So.
Right. So I think that we're also interested in maybe some partnerships for demonstration and people testing out different management strategies that we have so far only modeled. It would be very difficult. It would be difficult for us to convince Iowa State to do something radically different on this site, but it might not be that hard to convince somebody to do something radically different on one pothole in one of their fields. So we'd definitely be interested in that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you, and thanks to everybody else who joined in tonight and participated with some questions. We appreciate you tuning in, and hopefully we see you again next Tuesday or the week after that or the week after that. So, all right. Thanks again, Amy. Thanks, Stephen.
Well, thanks, Steve.